Welcome back, everyone, to the Social Media, Race, and Community Knowledge Practices Conference. We have made it to our final session for the day, and we'll be back tomorrow with several more thought-provoking presentations. There's going to be more information in the chat. We welcome those of you who are in attendance to share the conference website with friends, colleagues, people you think might be interested. This is a free conference. It's open to the public. So we really welcome folks to join. And we also welcome a Q&A from everybody who's in attendance. Sometimes the panelists throughout the conference have been more active, but we really welcome everybody who's attending to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Our last presenter today is Dr. Eric Bayruns García. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at McMaster University and Research Associate at the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science at the University of Johannesburg. Last year, he was Fellow in Residence at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. His presentation is How Are Statues of Robert E. Lee and Christopher Columbus Connected to the Murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd? After he speaks, we're going to have some comments by Dr. Shannon Spalding. Dr. Spalding is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Oklahoma State University and author of How We Understand Others, Philosophy and Social Cognition, which was published by Routledge in 2018. So now I want to turn it over to Dr. Bayruns García.
Well, thank you, Sherry, and thank you for organizing this amazing conference. It's really great to be involved, and I'm just going to share my screen. And you'd think as many times as I've done this, it would go right, and let's hope it goes well now. Let's see. Can you all see that? Okay, great. So I'm going to go for 20 minutes and then turn it over to Shannon for her comments. So in this talk, I have a few aims, but the most basic aim that I have is I want to answer the following question. How are the murders of Black Americans such as Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and innumerable others connected to monuments that honor historical figures such as Christopher Columbus and Robert E. Lee? And we can name a bunch of others. So history's chock full of people who were honoring, maybe we shouldn't honor. So this is the question. And I want to motivate a particular answer, at least part of an answer, which is that US statuary, that is the monuments and statues that honor these folks, transmit false information, right? False information rather than true information. And that partly explains the ignorance from which police act when they unjustly murder individuals such as Eric Garner, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so on. So that's kind of the basic point of this talk. I also, along the way, want to motivate a view of statuary transmission. The idea that statuary compose what I call an information, partly compose an information channel through which we receive information about what's morally right, what's morally wrong, morally valuable, morally not valuable. And that statuary is in part going to do this information transmission along with things like education curricula and numerous other things, right? Social media, things like that. So there's a total set of things that I think are acting as an information channel. But I think statuary play a really important role. Now, I also, in answering this question, I'm going to present a view of what I call cross-generational blame. And I'm going to present a view of its epistemic utility, where epistemic utility is the idea that something is good in terms of it causing more true beliefs amongst the population, say the US, rather than false belief. And my idea of cross-generational blame is blame that, for example, when I blame Christopher Columbus for his racist beliefs and actions, I'm blaming him from one generation and he's in another, right? So from one point in time to another, that's the basic idea. Okay, and you all can hear me okay, is that right? Okay, sorry, it's not a great connection. I've been trying to fix that all day. So this is Columbus Circle in Manhattan, right next to Central Park, which you can see in the corner there. And this statue in the middle is a statue of Christopher Columbus, for which the circle is named. And after George Floyd's murder and the murder of Breonna Taylor and others, this statue and many others like it went in for what I take to be proper defacement, right, and toppling. And I'm gonna, but the idea I have is that there's when folks went in and defaced these statues or this statuary, and another example of this is this in Charlottesville, the statue of Robert E. Lee. When folks went in to deface this statuary, and at least one idea they had in their head was that these statues and the figures, not only the statues, but the figures themselves are somehow connected to the murder of Black Americans, right? And of the ones I mentioned. So that's kind of like the intuition that I'm trying to cash out in part. So let me say something about Columbus. So Columbus said the following: they would make good and industrious service, in reference to the indigenous people of the island of La Española, which now houses or on which you can find the Dominican Republic in Haiti. He also said they are fit to be ruled, right, in reference to the indigenous inhabitants of the island of Hispaniola. Robert E. Lee said the following: the Blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction and growth. So these are all false beliefs, right? And these false beliefs involve content of this kind that where, lots of content, I think, but some of the content is that both indigenous persons and Black persons in the Americas don't have the same moral value as white persons in the Americas. That's at least one thing that's going along, that's being communicated here, right? And in part, that's what I think these statues often communicate, right? But as I mentioned, after the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, and others, protesters toppled these statues and monuments that honor folks like Columbus and Lee. And I'm trying to suggest that an intuition is that folks sense the connection between these statues and monuments and these acts of police violence and murder, right? Okay. So let me give you my talk's basic argument. The first premise in my talk's basic argument is the following: blaming these historical figures such as Columbus and Lee in the past can promote individuals' belief in the moral truth in the present. So the idea is when I blame Columbus in the past, a consequence is people are more likely to believe the moral truth now. And I'll say why you might think that. The second premise is statues and monuments that honor these figures represent a failure to blame these figures, right? So one thing that these statues in part represent is US society, or US society writ large, its failure to blame these figures for their racist beliefs and actions, right? The third premise in my basic argument is that these statues and monuments represent this failure to blame, or the fact that these statues and monuments represent this failure to blame promotes the pervasiveness and persistence of the ignorance from which US society and thus police act. The basic idea here is US society is not doing too well by way of the truth here, the moral truth, or the truth about racial injustice. And the police are just a part of US society. And therefore, they're going to be doing at least equally bad or bad as part of US society, right? And they're going to be acting out of this ignorance, from this ignorance. So I think if these premises are true or plausible, I can conclude that US society's failure to blame these figures for their racist beliefs and actions at least partly explains the moral ignorance from which US police murder Black persons, right? And I'm not saying this is a full explanation. I'm just trying to offer some piece of an explanation. Okay. Let me give you a sense of how I'm thinking about blame. So here I'm focusing on the efficacy or epistemic utility of third personal blame and judgment and how they influence present day persons' beliefs, right? Present day individual beliefs. So a basic idea I'm trading on or alluding to is that blame can regulate and align moral understanding in a community. And this is an idea that comes from Bernard Williams and Miranda Fricker, another philosopher, has developed this idea. The basic idea here is that when I blame you and you're a member of my community and you accept, you accept that you did wrong, you've come and you accept the blame as appropriate and maybe ask for forgiveness or something like that. Now we've come to share moral reasons that we didn't antecedently share. That's the basic idea. And it's through this mechanism that blame can actually cause a community to share moral reasons. Or you might think of like the abolitionists as blaming slaveholders during the 1800s and trying to get them to accept the content of the blame judgment. Now, of course, there was a lot of pressing back against this. Things don't go as we would like, but that's kind of maybe one way of thinking about this blame thing. But now that's second personal blame, me blaming you. But third personal blame is blame of a party that's not present, right? So it turns out, according to the social psychology literature, third personal blame is especially effective, even more so than second personal blame, at aligning moral beliefs or just beliefs in general, but that includes moral beliefs and behavior. So Sanando Gramaja, that's the epistemologist who I've cited on the screen. He cares about epistemic blame, about blame that has to do with things like forming beliefs on an irrational basis, or forming illogical beliefs, that kind of thing. So when we blame people, we can either, our blaming practices form part of have two sides, right? There's the negative bit, blaming, and then there's the positive bit. So when people form beliefs on a good basis, we say they're being rational, they're being reasonable, they're being logical. But he points to this child case, which I think gets across the idea. So he says, imagine a parents walking with their children and they see some people being racist that they pass by, and the parents will tell the children, oh, those people are just being silly racist, they're being irrational or something like that. Now the children are more likely to take on board the content of the blame judgment that they're being silly or being irrational racist. Why? Well, in part because some third party is being blamed as opposed to the child. The child's not going to press back against the blame, and the child wants to be part of the identity group, namely the family. So the basic idea here is when we blame folks third personally, if the person we're conveying the blame to about a third party is part of our in-group, part of our identity group, then they're more likely to accept the content of that blame judgment, right? And the in-group, out-group feature is just robust across the social sciences in terms of findings. We can look at sports teams, we can look at racial identity groups, gender identity groups, numeral identity groups, and you see this kind of effect, right? And here really what I'm pointing to is a kind of irrational basis on the belief, irrational basis on which beliefs are formed, right? We don't often form our beliefs for reasons that are rational. So in part what's here is kind of like this, there's just a mechanism that's going on that's affecting what we believe, right? People believe things for all kinds of reasons that aren't rational reasons. People tend to believe what feels good rather than bad. Like the belief I'm a good person. People tend to believe in ways that protect their identity. This is Kahans, I'm forgetting his first name, a legal theorist, has developed this idea of identity protective belief. And it turns out if you put arguments in Garamond font or different kinds of font, people are more likely to think they're true. These kinds of studies have been run. So that Garamond font has nothing to do with whether something's true or not, right? But that's just another kind of irrational concept, way we arrive at beliefs, right? Okay, so the first premise that I mentioned in my basic argument is blaming these historical figures such as Columbus and Lee in the past and promote belief in the moral truth in the present. And as I pointed out, third personal blame works especially well. I'm not going to go over this, but the basic idea I want you to take home from this is that, or take away, is that blame judgments transmit content. That's the idea, right? Content of like, Black persons have moral value, equal value to white persons, Indigenous persons have equal moral value to white persons, and other kinds of content, but that's the content at issue, right? And when we do this, when we blame Columbus, when I blame Columbus for his racist beliefs and actions, that's a kind of cross-generational. That's what I'm calling it as. The second premise in my argument is that the fact that these statues and monuments that honor these historical figures represent a failure to blame these particular historical figures. So if US society blamed these figures, then either this statuary would not obtain or would be far less numerous. That is one reason to think that these statues and monuments do represent failure to blame, right? If we really did blame these folks, we just wouldn't have these statues, or we have a lot less. And that seems pretty transparent to me, right? So the statuary transmits that these figures are praiseworthy. That's clear. And I think they also transmit often that, like, oh, well, they did things that were morally condemnable, but maybe they're not blameworthy, right? You get this kind of thing. Oh, Columbus was a creature of his time, and therefore, well, we shouldn't blame him. I think that's false. And actually, I think Shannon in the comments ahead thinks I think this, but I don't think this. I think Columbus was clearly blameworthy. So is Lee. Lots of people knew the moral truth, and they were just ignoring it. So let me be clear about that. So newspapers, educational curricula, social media, federal and state laws also do this kind of transmission, right? And now I have this idea that I've developed elsewhere of reliable information transmission through what I call information channels. Now, this is a bit jargony, so I apologize. But the idea comes from Dretski's 1981 book on knowledge. And he says this: a signal W carries the information that P, where P just stands for a proposition or English sentence that can be true or false. So I'll say that again: a signal W carries the information that P, just in case W wouldn't have transpired unless P, right? So the basic idea is like an information channel is reliable if when truth goes in the one end, it comes out the other. It only transmits actual events, something like that. Sure. I'll skip that point. But one thing to keep in mind is that the dominant group in any society, whether it's whites, US society, whether it's males across the planet or heterosexuals across the planet, have an outsized influence on information transmitted in comparison to non-dominant and less dominant groups. So it should be unsurprising that we have this going on with statuary. That's just the basic point. Okay, let me get to this third premise. So that the fact that these statues and monuments represent this failure to blame, say, Columbus and Robert E. Lee, promotes the pervasiveness and persistence, the ignorance from which US society and thus police and thus commit these murders, right? One reason to think that this is the case is that this statuary transmits this false information is in tension with cross-generational blame promoting belief in the moral truth. What do I mean by this? Well, a consequence of this is that the transmission of this information promotes or sustains the ignorance from which police act of in U.S. society act. So if statues that say honor Columbus form part of a statuary set, the total set of statuary in the U.S. That transmits these historical figures' actions, right? And the basic idea here is this is not coming across as I'd like. If statues are transmitting the information that these people are condemnable, like the actions are condemnable, but they're not blameworthy, then what we lose out on is this whole third person personal blame thing and its epistemic utility or effectiveness that I was pointing to. If you don't have the blaming, then you don't get the mechanism, then you don't get people forming the kinds of beliefs that I would hope they would have when you blame someone like Columbus, which is that indigenous people have equal moral value to white people and that black folks have equal moral value to white folks, right? That's the basic idea. You know, these folks are not merely condemnable. And if that's what's being transmitted, that's bad because they're blameworthy. And condemning is not the same as blame. Okay. Well, actually, I'll stop there and let Shannon give her comments.
Okay, thank you. I am going to, unfortunately, Shannon had a conflict come up. And so I'm going to go ahead and share her comments with any luck here in just a moment. Let's see. There we go. Okay, are you all seeing her slide, How Monuments, colorful slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. I will press play and hopefully we will all hear this. Oops. I'm not hearing anything, and I presume other people are not as well. Is that okay? I'm going to stop doing that then, and I am going to instead, I will read her comments on her behalf, which start by thanking the organizers for putting together this thought-provoking conference. Thanks also to Eric for this interesting and timely presentation. I found the overall conclusion of the paper plausible, and the defense of the first premise is persuasive and well-grounded in philosophical and social science research. I do, however, have some concerns about the structure of the argument. I'll spend my time here working through the structure of the argument and thinking of ways to strengthen the argument. In brief, Eric's argument is this. 1, blaming historical figures can promote belief in moral truth in people now. 2, monuments and statues represent a failure to blame historical figures. 3, that claim that monuments and statues represent a failure to blame historical figures promotes pervasive and persistent moral ignorance in the US, including for police. And that partly explains the moral ignorance from which US police murder Black people. Most of the talk is devoted to defending the first 2 premises, that blaming historical figures can promote belief in moral truth in people now, and that monuments and statues represent a failure to blame. And I find those defenses very compelling. It's the connection between premises 1 and 2 and the rest of the argument that I think needs a bit more work. It is clear from the talk that the argument is not meant to be a strict deductive argument where the premises logically imply and deductively prove the conclusion. Rather, the premises are meant to give support, evidence, or reason to believe the conclusion. Thus, logic chopping may be a little bit out of place in this context. Nevertheless, I think attention to the structure of the argument can reveal where we need a bit more support or evidence. Thus, I will do a bit of very dry argument analysis here, but the goal is to use that to strengthen the argument. Let me present the argument in more abstract form. In essence, Eric's argument is this: if A, then B. If we blame historical figures, then we will promote moral truth. Monuments and statues represent a failure to blame. So that negates the if we blame historical figures, we're not blaming them. So we end up with if not A, then not B. If we have a monument that represents a failure to blame, then we will have pervasive moral ignorance. And then if not B, then C. If we have pervasive moral ignorance, then we are more likely to have anti-Black violence in the US. As the philosophers in the audience will recognize, there's a flaw in this argument. The flaw, and I'm sorry that I'm reading, maybe I need to share the, why don't I share the script that I'm working from so that you can see exactly what she is. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to have to do this. Well, maybe I won't do that. But there's a flaw in this argument, which is that if you start out with if A, then B, and you then show not A, that doesn't actually lead to not B. That's a, so here's an example to explain this fallacy. So premise 1, smoking leads to lung cancer. Premise 2, Jane does not smoke. 3, if Jane doesn't smoke, then she won't get lung cancer. 4, if she doesn't get lung cancer, she'll be healthy. Clearly, this is not a sound argument. And that's because smoking leads to lung cancer, combined with one person's not smoking, doesn't show that they won't get lung cancer. The premises do not give support for the conclusion for a number of reasons. One perhaps rare counterexample is that sometimes non-smokers get lung cancer. So not smoking doesn't guarantee that you won't get lung cancer. Now let's come back to Eric's argument. We have the same structural problems. Premise 3, if we have monuments that represent a failure to blame, then we'll have more moral ignorance, needs more support. And not A, monuments are a failure to blame, does not give sufficient evidence for claim C, that there's going to be, that this supports anti-Black violence. On premise 3, there are many ways to add support. A particularly important line of support for premise 3 would be to show that other methods for promoting moral truth in the present are undercut by the presence of these monuments or statues. To show this, you'd need to know that monuments and statues for historical figures like Columbus and Lee undermine educational programming, school curricula, cultural messages, and so forth. For this to be persuasive, we need to have some understanding of the relative effectiveness of each of these signal transmitting channels. We also need more support for the connection between moral ignorance and anti-Black violence. Recall the conclusion: if we have pervasive moral ignorance, then we're more likely to have anti-Black violence in the US. It's very plausible that moral ignorance is an enabling condition for anti-Black violence, but the conclusion is much stronger than that insofar as it claims a causal relationship. Here's another way to put this point. There are many factors that lead to committing, condoning, and being apathetic about racial violence. Moral ignorance may be one, but we need more evidence that moral ignorance is an especially important factor. Just as an example, I imagine lack of empathy or empathy for one's in-group at the expense of out-groups also plays a very important role in committing, condoning, and being apathetic toward racial violence. In other words, it's plausible that many white Americans' conceptualizations of these interactions between police and Black Americans is shaped by who they empathize with more than by their moral knowledge. They may find especially white police officers easier to empathize with than Black Americans, in virtue of sharing some traits, race, and perhaps political views. And on most views, the connection between empathy and morality is messy and complicated. Thus, this is not, or at least not obviously, a version of the claim that moral ignorance leads to anti-Black violence. This is an alternative explanation of the committing, condoning, and apathy toward anti-Black violence. Thus, I would like to hear more from Eric about why he thinks the connection between moral ignorance and anti-Black violence is especially strong. So sorry that sharing didn't work out, but those are the comments, and we'll give Dr. Bayruns García a minute to respond.
Well, I can't say that put enough emphasis on the fact that that was like, I can't imagine having to give those comments that well on the fly. So thank you for that. But what do I have to say in response? I'm just going to share my screen again, and hopefully I don't share it in presenter view this time. It's in presenter view, I bet. Let's see. Oh, wait, what happened? There we go. So I'll just do it like this. Okay. So in response to Shannon's comments, I have this to say, and I'm just going to focus on the connection between, because there was a lot to say about the structure of the argument. Actually, I think I can fix the structure of the argument, even though I wasn't going for that to make it deductive, but that's a whole nother thing. But this is a good point on like, what's the connection? How strong is it between moral ignorance and anti-Black violence and Indigenous violence? So, I mean, in the early 1500s, you had Bartolomé de las Casas and Inés de Sepúlveda having what was we now call the Valladolid debate. And in that debate, really what they're getting at is that the argument is over moral ignorance, right? So Las Casas is attributing moral ignorance of the moral value of indigenous people to Sepúlveda, and he's arguing against Las Casas. They're kind of going back and forth in some sense. So right from the very beginning of like racial injustice and colonialism in the Americas, people saw the connection between what was happening in like world historical genocide and ignorance, right? So that's just one thing. Also, if you look at the history of chattel slavery in the US, right, so-called slaveholders would justify violence against Black persons and people and slaveholding itself on the basis of moral falsehoods about Black people, right? That's just true. So they saw a connection between their acts and the facts and the moral facts, right? And so did abolitionists, as I mentioned earlier. But then there's this interesting point that Shannon brings up about apathy and empathy and how that's related to, say, anti-BIPOC violence. And I think her thought is like, oh, maybe like a lack of empathy is what actually explains this more, or something like that. I think more than ignorance. I actually think that there's a lot in the literature to suggest that that's not how things go, causally speaking. So someone like, well, let me put it this way. So empathy, having empathy for someone probably depends on some kind of doxastic attitude, where that's just an attitude about a person, right? A belief you have regarding, say, indigenous persons, Black persons, woman, whoever the non-dominant group is, right? And if you have the facts straight, I mean, we can look and see when people started getting facts straight. There's not a one-to-one correlation here, clearly, but I think there is some kind of correspondence between having the moral facts straight and the kind of ensuing emotions that people have. So here, just to point to a little bit in the literature, Charles Mills talks about a phenomenon of white ignorance, where that's ignorance that's due to white supremacy as a political system, that's caused by white supremacy as a political system. And really one facet of white ignorance, right, is individuals not having the appropriate moral response to the moral act. So like white persons could look at a Black person being sold on a slave block and not have the appropriate moral response of horror. Right? And so someone like Charles Mills and other folks in this critical epistemology of race literature would probably put the order of explanation in terms of empathy the other way, right? They would actually say there's a tight link between the two, right? Between empathy and the moral facts. They're kind of very tightly conjoined. It's not like empathy is going to do the explaining all by itself. So I'll just stop there, but thank you for the comment, Shannon, even though you're not here.
All right, well, we are certainly open to questions from the audience. You all can drop those in the Q&A or in the chat. But I think I'd like to kind of kick it off, because I'm kind of thinking about monuments as an occasion for epistemic correction. And you did mention that the presence of a monument, I think, makes it challenging to get from, oh, this person's great, to this person's actually blameworthy, because often the thought is, oh, well, the person was ignorant. They were living in an era where the moral knowledge was absent. But I'm wondering what you think about the prospect of, instead of removing the monuments, doing some serious epistemic reframing to use them as an occasion for correction and to introduce blameworthiness into the picture, or if you think they kind of resist that. I think you are muted. So
Yeah, sorry about that. So this is a really great question. I don't take this up, at least in this paper, because this is such a difficult question. But it's the thought I have is to think about a place like Mexico. So after the revolution, you saw this statuary come down, right? And I think if Mexico's an example, then maybe the statuary just has to come down. But then again, like, maybe you put the statuary in, or the statues and monuments in museums. Like, I mean, gosh, we have all kinds of statuary from Greek and Roman antiquity in museums. Maybe that's where this statuary belongs. Or maybe there's some kind of intervention that you can make on the statuary in the places that they exist. I guess one thought I have is you'd have to have a lot of publicity around that intervention. It couldn't just be like, here, let's intervene and write some things on a little plaque. It'd have to be like a very prominent intervention. And one thing to keep in mind is this statuary went up in response to moral truths becoming more prominent in US society after the Civil War, in the case of the Civil War statues, right? This was in the 20s and 30s, and when precisely Southerners were worried about the moral truth getting out. But anyway, that's just a little bit I have by way of an answer.
No, that's a great point, though. It wasn't just a simple act of honoring. It was a complex act of introducing some moral didacticism in favor of white supremacy into the picture. Dr. Karen Frost Arnold is still here, and earlier she talked about the notion of epistemic trash, all the bad things that happen through community knowledge formation. And there's definitely some epistemic trash there. Well, I mean, we can continue having a dialogue, but I do want to invite other folks to put questions in the Q&A or the chat. Or I believe that those of you who are attendees may have the ability to raise your hands, and we can invite you to actually speak your questions out if you would like to. Well, I'm going to ask another question then, because I'm really fascinated by the role that the visual statuary offers. And that question is, it kind of goes to, I kind of interpreted the argument a little bit differently than Shannon did, I think. And I find myself wondering, okay, so the failure to blame that is manifest in this statuary is a contributor to present day ignorance. How big of a contributor is it relative to other kinds of factors? I'm just interested to think about how those things play together.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Shannon was quick to point out, like, well, actually in her comment, she says, oh, she presents statuary as a channel amongst others. And that's not how I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking like this channel has different streams, as it were, that compose it. That makes sense, right? So it has tributaries or something like this. Think of a braided stream that comes together or something like that. So social media, one thing I'm really interested in, and I think plays a big role here, is educational curriculum like US history textbooks. So we could probably point to a whole host of things that are doing this information transmission. It's an interesting empirical question, which one is doing the most work? I don't know. But the one reason that I point to the statutes is because, well, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other folks, they, folks latched onto these statutes. And I was trying to think like, well, what's going on there? What's motivating folks? And one thing that struck me was like, look, they see Columbus, they see Lee, and that's people see the connection between those figures and the role that these statutes play in this whole system that we have going on or have had for the last 500 years. So that's part of an answer. I see a kind of comment from Theodore. Maybe I should address that. I think it's a good one. Yeah, I guess my slide 10. I didn't even know I had my slide number. Thank you. So good. I didn't make this clear in the talk. I should have glossed this. So when I'm referring to ignorance, I'm kind of just rolling with Charles Mills's notion of white ignorance, where white ignorance involves is either false belief or lack of belief, right? So you can have white ignorance if you have a falsehood, like Christopher Columbus was a great moral guy. That's false. But then you could lack a true belief, like that indigenous persons have moral value, right? Suppose you don't have any view on it or something like that. Or I'll give you another example. In my Latin American philosophy class, students almost invariably have no notion of how many indigenous people died as a result of the conquest. And according to historians, it may be up to like 100 million indigenous persons in the 1500s. And my students have a sense that, of course, some folks died, but not the magnitude. So that's an instance where I think their lack of belief, they're not holding a false belief. And it's explained by white supremacy as a political system. So yeah, thank you for that opportunity to gloss that.
I see Dr. Karen Frost Arnold has a question.
Thanks. I really appreciate your talk so much. I wanted to ask, you just brought up Mills, and so that was actually whose work I was thinking about as you were talking. And I was wondering how you would connect, or are they two separate lines to a similar conclusion? His focus on social memory rather than blame. So I thought blame was an interesting new way of thinking about this, but sort of the way he often talks about monuments is this idea that monuments, holidays, etc., help us tell a story about who we are, say, as a nation, and they are the repositories of a memory, and part of it is what we're keeping alive and what stories we want to tell about ourselves. And so that always seemed like a compelling argument for me. So I was kind of wondering, what in addition does this notion of blame do that Mills was missing? Or do you see that they these 2 points go hand in hand? I hope that question made sense.
No, it makes lots of sense. So I certainly think what I'm saying, a lot of what I'm saying is motivated by his view of white ignorance. And I think what I'm saying is compatible with his view of social memory, where, right, so Mill cares about social memory largely because it results in people believing false things about white supremacy, right? So I think what I'm doing is offering just a little bit more of an added or complementary explanation of how social memory works in part, or one consequence of how, really, this is the way I would put it. I'm trying to paint a picture of one consequence of how social memory works in the US, if we're going to use like social memory talk, as it were, or that term. So yeah, so blame is just going to like be part of, I think, fall under what maybe Mills would call social memory and lead to what he called white ignorance.
Just for those of you here who aren't philosophers, who may not have been familiar with this paper's come up a couple of times today. Charles Mills's White Ignorance. I put a link in the chat to find more citation info in case anybody wants to follow that path. Does anybody else have questions that they would like to contribute? I was intrigued by one of how you framed one of your examples in talking about parents who are saying to their kids, those are silly, irrational racists. And I wondered about the, and I know this was just a quick example, but I wondered if the framing of silly and irrational, as opposed to bad, morally corrupt, I wondered what your thoughts were about that, and if that was an intentional kind of.
That's a great question. So here I'm just using Sanand Dogar-Mudgel's example that has to do more with epistemic blame as opposed to moral blame. And I often get this question about the child example, although not exactly the way you put it. So this is really helpful. Yeah, so I think I should probably just change his example in going forward to something that actually is relevant to the thing at issue in this paper, which is moral value, not epistemic value. So, right, because they're not just mere, although in his example, you can kind of criticize him for that because he's just pointing out that they're being irrational, but he leaves aside the moral part in his example, where I want to emphasize the moral part. And I do care about the epistemic part. So that's a great suggestion.
Okay, so that's just sort of picking up. Okay, yeah, because that made me wonder, like, well, are we really morally blaming them if we're calling them silly? It might facilitate dismissing them, but maybe not in the way that is most important for, like, racism is really bad. Well, I'm not seeing other questions in the chat, so I really want to thank you, Eric, for your great talk, and thank Shannon Spalding in absentia for her comments. For all of those of you in the audience, thank you so much for attending today. We are going to be back tomorrow for another day full of stimulating presentations. Please do share the conference link with friends, colleagues, or students who might like to join tomorrow. We will be back here at the same webinar link at 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, and of course, whatever time zone the rest of you all may be in, you may need to translate from there. But thank you so much for attending, and thanks to all of our wonderful speakers and presenters, and we'll see you tomorrow.